Humans produce offspring by a process we call sexual reproduction, where haploid sperm cells, remember haploid means half the number of chromosomes, haploid sperm cells are produced by the testes of males, fertilized haploid oocytes that are produced by the ovaries of the females. Results of this fertilization include making a diploid, 2 sets of chromosomes, a diploid cell that we call a zygote. And of course that contains 1 set of chromosomes from the sperm cell, 1 set of chromosomes from the egg cell. Males and females have anatomically different reproductive organs, but they're designed to produce and nourish and transport these haploid cells to facilitate fertilization, and in females sustain the growth of the embryo and the fetus. The male and female reproductive organs can be grouped by function. The gonads, which are the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female, yes, I know what you're thinking. Females do have gonads. Gonads are just the structures in the human body that produce the sex cells. So the gonads, testes in males and ovaries in females, produce gametes, the sperm cells and the egg cells, and they also secrete the sex hormones. But there's a varied group of ducts that store and transport the gametes, and then there's also accessory organs that produce substances that protect the gametes and also help to facilitate their movement. There are supporting structures such as the penis in males and the uterus in females that assist in the delivery of the gametes, and the uterus is also, of course, where a baby's going to grow when pregnancy occurs. So let's look first at the male reproductive system because it is the less complicated system. The male has to create the gametes, the sperm cells, store them, mature them, and deliver them into the vaginal canal for fertilization to occur. So that's a less complicated system than the female system, which has to do all of that, create the gametes, mature and store the gametes, the egg cells, get them into the fallopian tube, and then once fertilization occurs, we also have to raise a baby inside our body. So a little more complicated. So we'll begin with the male. So the organs of the male reproductive system include the testes, which are housed in a pouch called the scrotum that is outside the body, the epididymis, which is posterior and a little bit anterior to the testis. Singular is testis, T-E-S-T-I-S. Plural is testes, T-E-S-T-E-S. Then you have the vas deferens, sometimes called the ductus deferens, where that sperm cells travel through, up and over and behind the urinary bladder, where the vas deferens then merges with these tubes called the seminal vesicles, and these are going to secrete some of the fluid to the ejaculation. The tube then merges and runs through the prostate gland, which is inferior to the bladder. So this part of the tubular structure now is called the ejaculatory duct. Here you can see the urethra coming from the bladder, running through the prostate gland and merging with the ejaculatory duct. And then the urethra continues through the root of the penis, down through the shaft of the penis, through the glans penis, what we commonly call the head of the penis, to the external urethral orifice where the ejaculation leaves the penis. So these are some of the major organs that we're going to talk about. Some of the glands secrete these fluids. So we've talked about the ducts that are the passageways, some of the accessory glands, the primary structures or the primary reproductive organs, which are the testes. And now we'll begin to look a little bit more at some of the individual structures. But also keep in mind that the testes of the males not only produce the sperm cells, but they secrete hormones called androgens. The primary hormone, of course, in the male is testosterone, but there are other derivatives that are very close chemically and have very similar effects as well. So the duct system is going to transport and store the sperm cells, helps to assist in their maturation, and then, of course, allows a passageway for them to get to get out of the male's body and into the vaginal canal. Semen contains the sperm cells plus all the secretions that come from those secondary or those accessory glands, such as the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland. And also, I've neglected to show you, right here you have the tiny little bulbourethral glands that are also going to contribute a little bit of fluid to the ejaculation. So all of this semen containing all these secretions, of course, is going to carry the sperm cells outside of the body in the process of ejaculation. So the supporting structures have a lot of different functions. The penis's role is to deliver sperm into the female reproductive tract so that fertilization can occur, and the scrotum, of course, functions to support the testes. So we'll look first at the scrotum. So the scrotum is a supporting structure for the testes. It consists of loose skin and subcutaneous tissues that underlie that loose skin that hang from the root or the attached portion of the penis. Externally, the scrotum looks like a single pouch of skin separated into lateral portions by a medial ridge that's called the raphe. Internally, though, the scrotal septum divides the scrotum into two different compartments, and each one of those compartments contains a single testis. That septum is made up of subcutaneous tissues and muscle tissues called the dartos muscle. So the dartos muscle is made up of smooth muscle, and when it contracts, it draws the scrotum closer together and helps to work with another muscle called the cremaster muscle. And that cremaster muscle, cremaster means suspender, sort of works like a suspender and helps to pull the scrotum up. So the cremaster muscle actually runs through the spermatic cord, and this, of course, is an opened version of the spermatic cord. Here you can see that scrotal septum. On each side you can see an individual testis. So that scrotal septum separates the scrotum into two different pouches. That way, if one testis develops cancer or becomes diseased or an infection and is unable to create sperm cells, it's separated or divided from the other side so that one testis can remain healthy. What else can we see in this particular image? So there's the raphe that you see externally on the superficial part of the scrotum. I wanted to show you something else while we've got it here. Here you can see the cremaster muscle. So a part of it has been opened up so that you can see internally in that spermatic cord. You can see the blood vessels and some nervous tissue, and there you see the vas deferens running up through that spermatic cord. But the cremaster and the dartos muscle, when they contract, they pull the scrotum up closer to the body to help maintain temperature. The location of the scrotum and the contraction of the muscle fibers regulate the temperature of the testes. So normally sperm production occurs best at about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius below normal body temperature. So this lower temperature is maintained within the scrotum because it's outside the pelvic cavity. But when the scrotum is cold, if the body is in cold temperatures, the cremaster muscle and the dartos muscle contract, and that contraction pulls the testes closer together, and the cremaster, of course, being the suspender muscle, pulls that scrotum up closer to the body so that it is closer to the heat within the abdominal cavity. The testes, as we mentioned, are housed in the scrotum, so they're oval glands. The testes develop near the kidneys in the posterior part of the abdomen, and they have to descend down into the scrotum through inguinal canals or passageways in the lower part of the anterior abdominal wall during the latter half of the 7th month of fetal development. So until that point, they're in what we call the retroperitoneal space. Remember, the peritoneum is the serous membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. So the testes actually develop in the retroperitoneal space and then descend through that inguinal canal down into the scrotum during the 7th month of development. The testis is surrounded by a fibrous capsule that's composed of dense irregular connective tissue that's called the tunica albuginea. It also extends inward and forms little septa or dividers that separate the testis into a series of internal compartments called lobules. Each of the lobules, and there's about 200 to 300 of them, contains 1 to 3 very tightly coiled tubules called seminiferous tubules. And it's within these seminiferous tubules, so here you see a lobule, here's a lobule. Within that you have these coiled tubes, and that's your seminiferous tubules. And it's within the seminiferous tubules where spermatogenesis occurs. Spermatogenesis, of course, is the making or the origin of those sperm cells. This slide just gives you a more realistic view of the testis and a part of the scrotum and the spermatic cord in a cadaver. So here you can see the testis. Here's the epididymis. This is a part of the scrotum, and you can see here that the rest of it has been cut away so that you can see. Here you can see a little bit of a connective tissue covering. This is not the tunica albuginea. Here you can see the tunica albuginea that actually surrounds the internal part of the testis and then goes into the testis and separates it into the lobules, which is not really visible in this. It's much easier to see, of course, in the drawing, but you can also see a cut-through section of the spermatic cord and some of the vasculature that is running through it along with the vas deferens. Alright, so now let's talk a little bit more about what's going on in these seminiferous tubules. So within the seminiferous tubules there are two types of cells. You have the spermatogenic cells, which are all of these, and these big orange globs are sustentacular cells. So here you see the nucleus of one sustentacular cell, and there's a nucleus of another sustentacular cell, and here's a part of another sustentacular cell. So these are just great big cells that basically surround the spermatogenic cells that are going to form the sperm cells. So the sustentacular cells have several functions in supporting spermatogenesis. The stem cells are called spermatogonia, and they remain dormant during childhood but actively begin producing sperm at puberty. So once they begin dividing, they create cells called primary spermatocytes, and then secondary spermatocytes, spermatids, and then sperm cells. After a sperm cell is formed, it's released into the lumen or the opening of the seminiferous tubule. Embedded among, as we see, those spermatic cells in the seminiferous tubule are those large sustentacular cells that are also sometimes called Sertoli cells. So they extend from the basement membrane, okay, so from here, the basement membrane of the seminiferous tubule, all the way to the opening of the lumen. Between these cells, you have tight junctions. So here you can see a tight junction. There's a tight junction. Here's a tight junction. So between the sustentacular cells, you have these really tight junctions that join the neighboring sustentacular cells to each other, and they form an obstruction known as the blood-testis barrier, because substances first have to pass through the sustentacular cells before they can reach that developing sperm cells. So by isolating the developing sperm cells from the blood-testis barrier prevents the immune system from attacking these cells, because remember, sperm cells are not formed until puberty, and your immune system's already been programmed to know what cells belong to you and to respond and destroy something that's new that they don't know, right? So the blood-testis barrier protects the developing sperm cells by those tight junctions not allowing the immune system to respond to what would be recognized as foreign cells. The sustentacular cells support and protect the developing spermatogenic cells in several ways as well. They nourish the spermatocytes and the spermatids and the sperm. They phagocytize excess cytoplasm as the sperm development proceeds. They control the movements of the spermatogenic cells and release sperm into the lumen of the seminiferous tubule before storage and the final maturation process begins. They also produce fluid for sperm transport, secrete a hormone called inhibin, and regulate the effects of testosterone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So here you can see the spermatogonia, okay, and when they begin dividing, they're going to create smaller and smaller cells as they go through meiosis 1 and then meiosis 2, and then form spermatids. Now we're going to look more in detail at this particular process. I was about to move to the next slide, and then I looked and I realized that I didn't say anything about the interstitial cells. So in the spaces between the seminiferous tubules, there are clusters of cells called interstitial cells. So you can see a couple of interstitial cells here. They're usually found in large clusters between those seminiferous cells. These are sometimes called Leydig cells, Leydig, but they secrete testosterone, which is the most important and the most prevalent androgen. Remember, an androgen is just a male sex hormone that promotes the development of masculine characteristics. Testosterone is also what promotes a man's libido or sex drive. All right, so before we move, I wanted to talk just a little bit about a clinical connection called cryptorchidism. So remember I mentioned that the testes develop in the retroperitoneal space and then they descend into the scrotum. But there's a condition known as cryptorchidism. Crypt is hidden, orchid means testis, where the testes don't descend down into the scrotum. It usually occurs in about 3% of full-term infants, but is much more common and results or appears in about 30% of premature infants. So if it's left untreated, if both sides don't descend, so untreated bilateral cryptorchidism usually results in sterility because the cells that have to start this spermatogenesis process are destroyed by the higher temperature of the pelvic cavity or inside the abdominal cavity, right? So the chance of testicular cancer is much higher, 30 to 50% greater in the cryptorchid testes. The testes of about 80% of boys with cryptorchidism will eventually descend spontaneously during the first year of life. But when it doesn't, of course, this may need to be surgically corrected, and ideally that would be done before 18 months of age.